Every single day, somewhere in the world, a headline appears about the British royal family. Sometimes it is something significant, a health update or a diplomatic development or a family milestone that carries genuine weight and genuine news value. More often, it is something considerably smaller, a photograph taken at a particular angle, a gesture interpreted through a particular lens, a source described as being close to the palace who may or may not actually exist, offering an opinion about something that may or may not have actually happened. The volume of royal coverage produced by the global media machine on any given day is extraordinary, and the relationship between that coverage and the actual truth of what is happening inside the institution is something that most people who consume it have never had properly explained to them. Because the truth behind royal headlines is considerably more complicated, considerably more manufactured, and considerably more interesting than most people who read those headlines ever stop to appreciate, to understand how royal coverage actually works. You have to start with the ecosystem that produces it. And that ecosystem is unlike any other in journalism. There are reporters who have covered the royal family for their entire professional careers, who have spent decades cultivating sources inside and around the palace, who understand the specific rhythms and codes and conventions of the beat in ways that take years to learn. These are serious professionals doing serious work, and the best of them produce journalism that is genuinely informative and genuinely holds the institution to account in ways that matter. But they exist alongside a much larger population of content producers who have no particular expertise in the subject and no particular commitment to accuracy, who are simply feeding a global appetite for royal content with whatever material can be assembled quickly enough to meet the demands of a 24-hour news cycle that never stops and never sleeps. The headlines that emerge from these two very different kinds of journalism look identical on the page. They have the same font, the same confident declarative energy, the same implicit claim to be telling you something true and significant. Distinguishing between them requires more effort than most consumers of news are willing or able to invest, and the people who produce royal coverage know this. The mechanics of how royal stories get made is something that very few people outside the industry fully understand, and pulling back the curtain on those mechanics is the first step toward understanding why so many royal headlines bear such a complicated relationship to reality. The palace itself is one of the primary sources of royal news, which seems obvious but has implications that are not always obvious. When Buckingham Palace or Kensington Palace releases information, it does so for reasons. Those reasons are sometimes straightforwardly informational, genuine attempts to keep the public accurately informed about the activities and circumstances of the royal family. But they are also sometimes strategic, carefully calculated releases of specific information designed to shape the public narrative in particular ways, to redirect attention from things the institution would prefer not to discuss or to frame ongoing situations in ways that serve institutional interests. The people who manage palace communications are skilled professionals who understand the media environment they are operating in with considerable sophistication. They know which publications are more likely to receive a particular kind of story sympathetically. They know which journalists can be relied upon to frame information in ways that align with the palace's preferred narrative and which are more likely to complicate it with inconvenient context or skeptical questioning. They know how to time releases of information for maximum effect, dropping positive stories at moments when they will crowd out negative coverage, or releasing information that might generate controversy at moments when the news cycle is already crowded with competing stories that will limit the available attention. This is not unique to the palace. Every major institution and every major public figure engages in this kind of strategic communications management. But the palace does it with a particular sophistication that reflects decades of practice and a very high-stakes environment in which the consequences of getting it wrong can be severe. On the other side of this relationship are the journalists and publications that cover the royal family, and their motivations and incentives are at least as complicated as the palace's. Royal stories generate traffic. They generate sales. They generate the kind of sustained audience engagement that is becoming increasingly difficult to achieve in a fragmented and competitive media landscape. A royal headline on a slow news day can be the difference between a publication having a good day or a bad day commercially, and that commercial reality shapes editorial decisions in ways that are not always acknowledged, but that are very real. The pressure to produce royal content is constant and relentless, and it creates incentives to publish stories that are not as solidly sourced as responsible journalism requires, to sensationalize information that is actually quite mundane, to present speculation as fact and rumor as reporting. The sourcing conventions that have developed around royal journalism deserve particular scrutiny because they are one of the primary mechanisms through which unverified information gets presented as authoritative fact. The phrase, "a source close to the palace," is one of the most frequently used and least examined constructions in all of journalism. It appears in royal stories constantly, lending an air of insider knowledge and institutional authority to claims that may be based on anything from genuine inside information to complete invention. Who exactly is a source close to the palace? The answer encompasses an enormous range of possibilities. At one end, it might be a current or former palace employee with genuine first-hand knowledge of the matters being discussed. At the other end, it might be someone who once attended an event at which members of the royal family were present, or someone who knows someone who works in a building adjacent to a royal residence, or someone who has simply decided to present their own speculation as informed opinion. The phrase tells the reader nothing about which of these possibilities applies in any given instance, and publications use it in ways that exploit the ambiguity. The competitive dynamics between different publications and different national media traditions add another layer of complexity to the picture. The British tabloid press, which has historically been the primary vehicle for royal coverage, operates according to conventions that are quite different from those of broadsheet journalism or broadcast news. And those differences matter enormously when trying to assess the reliability of any given royal story. The tabloids have broken genuine royal stories over the years, stories that were true and important, and that would not have come to light without their aggressive reporting. They have also published stories that were fabricated or distorted beyond recognition, that caused genuine harm to real people, and that were produced by methods including phone hacking and other illegal activities that have since been exposed and condemned in multiple court proceedings. The phone hacking scandal, which resulted in the closure of the News of the World, and in legal proceedings that produced significant settlements and significant revelations about the practices of the British tabloid industry, fundamentally changed the context in which royal journalism operates. It demonstrated in the most direct possible way that some of the royal stories that had been presented as the product of legitimate journalism were actually the product of criminal intrusion into private communications. It demonstrated that sources described as being close to the palace were sometimes not sources at all, but rather the product of illegal eavesdropping on private phone messages. And it demonstrated that the publications involved had known what they were doing and had chosen to do it anyway because the commercial rewards of having exclusive royal content were sufficient to override whatever ethical reservations might have existed. The consequences of this history for how royal coverage should be read and evaluated are significant. When a publication publishes a story about the royal family and attributes it to palace sources, the reader is entitled to ask a series of questions that most readers never think to ask. How is this information obtained? Is the source being described accurately in terms of their actual proximity to the events being described? Has this publication been involved in previous instances of illegal news gathering? Is there any independent corroboration for the claims being made? Has the palace been given an opportunity to respond? And if so, what did they say? These are the questions that good journalism answers and that bad journalism avoids. And a significant proportion of royal coverage falls into the latter category. The relationship between the palace and specific publications is itself a source of systematic distortion in royal coverage. The palace has relationships of varying warmth and varying usefulness with different media organizations, and those relationships shape what gets published in ways that are invisible to the ordinary reader. Publications that maintain cooperative relationships with the palace tend to receive early access to information, invitations to official events, and the kind of background briefings that allow their journalists to write with apparent authority and insider knowledge. Publications that the palace regards as hostile or unreliable tend to receive less of this access, which means their coverage is more likely to rely on speculation and unofficial sources that are harder to verify. This system of differential access creates incentives for publications to maintain the kind of relationship with the palace that keeps the access flowing, which means avoiding coverage that the palace finds too challenging or too uncomfortable. It is a form of soft censorship that operates through commercial incentives rather than through any formal restriction. And it means that even publications that pride themselves on serious journalism are sometimes pulling their punches on royal stories because the cost of losing palace access is too high. The result is a media environment in which the palace has considerably more control over its own coverage than a democracy's accountability standards would ideally permit, even accounting for the monarchy's particular constitutional status. The international dimension of royal coverage introduces additional complications that are worth understanding. The British royal family is covered extensively not just in Britain but in the United States, in Australia, in Europe, in countries across the globe that have no formal connection to the monarchy and no particular expertise in its internal workings. American coverage of the royal family in particular tends to operate with less familiarity with the specific codes and conventions of British royal culture, and sometimes with less skepticism about claims that British royal journalists who know the beat well would immediately question. American audiences have enormous appetite for royal content, and American publications and networks are very willing to serve that appetite regardless of the quality of the sourcing behind the stories they are telling. The Harry and Meghan situation has been one of the most instructive case studies in how royal coverage works and how dramatically it can diverge from reality depending on which media outlet you are reading and which country you are in. The British tabloid coverage of Meghan in particular, from the earliest days of her relationship with Harry, was shaped by editorial choices and framing decisions that produced a portrait that was consistently less sympathetic and less charitable than the portrait being offered by international media and even by some British broadsheets. The differences in coverage were sometimes subtle and sometimes startling, with identical events being described in language that produced completely different impressions depending on which publication you were reading. The cumulative effect of reading only one part of this coverage landscape was to develop a distorted picture of a person and a situation that bore only a partial relationship to anything that could be independently verified. The palace's own communications choices contributed to this distortion, not necessarily through deliberate dishonesty, but through the selective sharing of information that is inherent in any institutional communications strategy. Information that made the institution look sympathetic was shared. Information that complicated the narrative was withheld. The specific grievances that Harry and Meghan were raising internally about media treatment and institutional support and the specific incidents they later described publicly were not acknowledged in any palace communication during the period when they were occurring. The public picture of a happy integration that the official communications were painting bore little relationship to the private reality that was building toward the rupture of early 2020. When that rupture came, when Harry and Meghan announced their intention to step back from royal duties, and the full scale of the private conflict became public, the contrast between the official communications that had preceded it and the reality they had concealed was dramatic enough to generate a significant loss of public trust in the palace's communications. If the official picture had been so wrong about something this significant, what else had it been wrong about? This is the question that institutional communications failures always generate, and it is a question that the palace has been working to address ever since. With the greater transparency and greater honesty that have characterized the communications of the new era. The social media dimension of royal coverage has added a layer of complexity that is genuinely new and that has changed the dynamics of how royal stories spread and how they are assessed. Before social media, a royal story lived or died largely by whether established media organizations chose to pick it up and amplify it. The gatekeeping function of traditional journalism, however imperfectly exercised, provided some check on the spread of completely fabricated material. Social media has dissolved that gatekeeping function almost entirely. A story, true or false, complicated or simple, can now spread to millions of people within hours of appearing, and the mechanisms for correcting false stories spread far more slowly and reach far fewer people than the false stories themselves. The environment for royal misinformation is more permissive than it has ever been, and the people most vulnerable to that misinformation are the vast majority of royal followers who have no particular expertise in the subject and no tools for evaluating the credibility of what they are reading. The specific patterns of misinformation that circulate about the royal family tend to cluster around a few recurring themes. Health misinformation is one of the most persistent, with speculation about the medical conditions of various royals circulating constantly and often bearing no relationship to anything medically informed. The period before Catherine's cancer diagnosis became public was particularly toxic in this regard, with an enormous volume of speculation about her absence from public life that ranged from the merely uninformed to the deliberately malicious. The fact that the actual situation, a serious cancer diagnosis in a woman in her early 40s, was more serious than most of the speculation had suggested, did not retrospectively validate the speculation. It simply demonstrated that speculation conducted without actual information is capable of occasionally stumbling toward accuracy without any of the accountability that actual journalism involves. Relationship speculation is another persistent theme, with the state of various royal marriages and family relationships being constantly analyzed and constantly misrepresented. The specific state of the relationship between William and Harry has generated an extraordinary volume of coverage, most of it based on the interpretation of photographs and public appearances rather than any actual knowledge of what is happening in private conversations. When the two brothers stand near each other at a public event, their body language is analyzed with an intensity that would be more appropriate for the study of diplomatic negotiations between hostile states. When they do not appear together at an event where they might have been expected to, the absence is treated as evidence of a deterioration in relations that may or may not be accurate. The emulative effect of this coverage is to create a constantly shifting narrative about the relationship that reflects the needs and preferences of the narrative's producers more than it reflects any actual knowledge of what the relationship is actually like. The truth that sits behind the most dramatic and most consumed royal headlines is usually something more mundane and more human than the headline suggests. An institution staffed by human beings making decisions under pressure with imperfect information and competing priorities and the constant challenge of managing a public role in a private life. A family with genuine affections and genuine conflicts and genuine misunderstandings and the particular difficulty of conducting those normal human dramas under conditions of extraordinary public scrutiny. People who are sometimes gracious and sometimes not, sometimes wise and sometimes mistaken, sometimes living up to the responsibilities of their position, and sometimes falling short of them. The gap between this reality and the headlines it generates is maintained by a system that has powerful incentives to keep it wide. The wider the gap, the more dramatic the stories that can be told about what is happening and what it means. The closer the coverage gets to the actual complexity of the reality, the less it conforms to the simple narratives that generate the most engagement and the most revenue. This is not a problem unique to royal journalism. It is a problem with popular journalism broadly, the tendency to simplify and sensationalize and to prioritize the emotionally resonant story over the accurate but complicated one. But it is particularly pronounced in the royal context because the subject matter is so endlessly fascinating to so many people and the appetite for it so reliably enormous. The people inside the institution understand the system well and navigate it with varying degrees of sophistication and varying degrees of success. The most effective royal communications, the moments when the palace manages to shape the public narrative in ways that are both honest and strategically effective, tend to be the ones that work with the media's appetite for human stories rather than against it. The cancer disclosures of 2024 worked so well, in part because they gave the media exactly what it is always looking for, a story with genuine human stakes and genuine emotional resonance, but did so on the palace's terms and with the palace's framing, leaving very little room for the kind of speculative gap-filling that had produced so much harmful coverage in the preceding months. Learning to read royal coverage with appropriate critical awareness is not a skill that most people have been taught, and the consequences of reading it uncritically are real. People form opinions about the monarchy and about the individuals within it based on coverage that may be substantially inaccurate. They develop emotional relationships to these narratives, becoming invested in particular versions of events and resistant to information that complicates those versions. They participate in social media conversations that amplify misinformation in ways that have real effects on real people's reputations and well-being. They vote in countries where the future of the monarchy is a live political question, based on pictures of the institution that may be seriously distorted by decades of coverage that served the interests of media organizations more than it served the interests of public understanding. The truth behind royal headlines is not a single simple truth that can be stated once and understood completely. It is a set of truths about how information is gathered and shaped and distributed and consumed, about the incentives that drive different actors in the ecosystem to behave as they do, about the gap that exists and has always existed between institutional appearance and institutional reality, and about the ways in which both the palace and the media that covers it manage that gap for their own purposes. Understanding those truths does not make the royal family less interesting. If anything, it makes the actual story more interesting than the simplified version, because the actual story involves real human complexity and real institutional dynamics, and the genuinely fascinating question of how one of the world's most unusual institutions is navigating one of the most challenging periods in its long history. The headlines will keep coming every day from every corner of the world, telling stories that are sometimes true and sometimes false, and usually somewhere in the complicated middle. The readers who understand how they are made will read them differently from the readers who do not. They will ask different questions and reach different conclusions and have a relationship to the institution they describe that is grounded in something more solid than the manufactured drama of the daily news cycle. And that more grounded understanding is, in the end, the most honest tribute that can be paid to a story that is genuinely worth understanding.